Started. You remember last week, make sure I'm on the right thing. All right. Last week, we talked about the Jewish historical sources. So remember talking about Josephus and Philo and their references to the early Christians. That was very interesting. We got into that. Then we talked about the Roman historical accounts. And we got started on that, but then we ran out of time. So then, after we finish the Roman historical accounts, this is what we'll go to next. That'll be early Christian writings and the ideas of historical authenticity around each of these three different sources. The big thing that we're pushing back against is the skeptics. Does anyone remember what the skeptics' claims about the gospel accounts are? Gospel accounts were written later, they were forgeries. What else? Skeptics say that it's just myth, that people who wrote the gospel accounts made it all up, or they added things like miracles into the accounts. Any other criticisms from the skeptics? Remember, on the textual criticism side, they paint a picture of this chain of copies of copies of copies of copies. And so if you mess up the game of telephone at one point in the chain, well, then the whole thing is unreliable and you don't know what the original document said. The problem with comparing it to the game of telephone is that's kind of a preschool game that you do with children, and very often you have children who are intentionally messing up the message along the way. Yes, Walter is one of those. I can tell by the smile. You know who you are, you people who mess up the message. And then there are children who have limited understanding and cognitive powers, and it's just a game. Where when you look at the people who are actually copying the scriptures, these were people who devoted their entire lives to becoming extremely skilled professionals, and it was their job to make it as precisely correct as possible. And they had checks in place to ensure the quality of their work. So the comparison even to the game of telephone isn't a fair comparison, because I've never played telephone with a room full of seminary professors, right? Totally different game. Not as fun with teenage, because you go around and it's just the same message at the end. Yeah. So anyway, the historical authenticity is called into question. But if you go and look at some of the very early extra-biblical sources, they go and show that there is historical validity to the gospel claims. And in fact, when you compare the historical sources with what the Bible says, there is really no reason to even doubt the scriptures, let alone believe that they're made up or false. So, getting back into the Roman historical sources, last week we talked about Tacitus, how he confirms Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Remember, we talked about the Pilate stone in the archaeology section. Tacitus is the guy who incorrectly gave Pilate the wrong title, and then the Pilate stone revealed that the New Testament actually had the right title. And then Suetonius is very interesting. He mentions disturbances called by Chrestus, indicating early Christian activity in Rome. And he's the one who talks about Nero burning Rome and blaming it on the Christians. So he's pushing that off on them. When you read the New Testament, Acts 18:2 is where we have the New Testament record of the Christians' persecution under Nero. So there's some parallels there between Suetonius and New Testament. But that brings us to where we're about to get a little bit more granular. We're going to talk about Pliny. I call him Pliny, but I guess that's probably wrong. Pliny the Younger. When we look at Pliny, he describes Christians worshiping Jesus as God and practicing baptism in his letters to Emperor Trajan. In his letters, he has Book 10, letter 96, his letter to Emperor Trajan. He has a very interesting account, and it's a little bit longer, but even if we have to come back to this lesson a third time, I think it's worth you guys hearing this letter in its entirety, because the whole thing has a whole lot of implications for Christians. So keep in mind, this is written probably within 16 years of the New Testament canon being finished. The Apostle John wrote the book of Revelation in 95 AD. By, I believe this letter was probably written in 116 AD. So this is, 21 years later? Very close proximity to the closing of the New Testament. And this is what the Governor Pliny had to say. So he's a ruler in this region, and he is writing to the emperor asking, how do you want me to handle this problem? And he says, "It is a rule, sir, which I inviolably observe, to refer myself to you in all my doubts. For who is more capable of guiding my uncertainty or informing my ignorance? Having never been present at any trials of the Christians, I am unacquainted with the methods and limits to be observed, either in examining or punishing them." So he's writing to his superior in their authority structure, and he's saying, hey, I don't know what you want me to actually do with these Christians, but let me tell you what I know about them. And so he goes on. Whether any difference is to be made on account of age, or no distinction is allowed between the youngest and the adult. Whether repentance admits to a pardon, or if a man has once been a Christian, it avails him nothing to recant. Whether the mere profession of Christianity, albeit without crimes, or only the crimes associated therewith, are punishable, in all these points I am greatly doubtful. But what he's recognizing is that most of these Christians hadn't committed any crime other than following Jesus Christ. So in Rome at that time, Christianity was banned. Christians were deemed as atheists because they did not believe in the plurality of gods. And so because of their refusal, especially to worship the emperor as a god, then they were basically executed for treason. They're not giving the emperor his due, and so they're falling under the government hate. Now, they're being executed because they aren't bowing to worship the emperor. However, remember, these people committed no crimes. They're completely innocent of anything else, and he's about to note here how these Christians actually are promoting virtues among the people. So let's go on and read what he says. "In the meanwhile, the method I have observed towards those who have been denounced to me as Christians is this. I interrogated them whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question twice again, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they still persevered, I ordered them to be executed. For whatever the nature of their creed might be, I could at least feel no doubt that the contumacy and inflexibility and obstinance deserved chastisement. So just because they were being rebellious, that was enough reason for me to have these people executed. There were others also who possessed with the same infatuation, but being citizens of Rome, I directed them to be carried thither." So if anyone was a Roman citizen, Pliny wasn't comfortable executing a Roman, and so because of their citizenship, he would send them off to Trajan to go through trial. But he'd never been there for an actual trial. You see, someone who was not a Roman, under the Roman emperor, could just be executed on the spot by the word of a governor. But if they had the right of citizenship, like Paul did, they actually had to have their day in court. They had to have fair representation, be able to present their case, and defend themselves against their accusers. So for the Roman citizens, Pliny's real nervous about doing anything legal or prosecuting them, having them executed. But he's more than willing to do it to someone who's not a citizen. These accusations spread as... Ooh, it jumped on me. These accusations spread, as is usually the case, from the mere fact of the matter being investigated and several forms of mischief coming to light. A placard was put up without any signature, accusing a large number of persons by name. So someone put up a sheet of paper It had a list of people and said, these people are Christians. And so because this evidence came to the government, they said, well, we should investigate it. But they didn't know who the source was. They don't know who informed on the Christians. So they took this list and arrested all the people on the list, and then they would put them through this series of questions asking if they're a Christian. If they said, no, I'm not a Christian, and they were willing to go along with the governor, well, then they'd be released. But if they said, I am a Christian, and they would not recant or renounce Christ, well, then that's when they would face execution. So this placard was put up, and those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, who repeated after me an invocation to the gods, and offered an adoration with wine and frankincense to your image, which I ordered to be brought for that purpose, together with those of the gods, and who finally cursed Christ, none of which acts, it is said, those who really are Christians can be forced in performing these things, I thought it proper to discharge. So to him, the clearest way to actually prove that someone isn't a follower of Christ is to have him worship false gods, have them worship the emperor, and have them curse Christ. Because he's like, a Christian can't do any one of those things. So if I have them do all three, then I know for sure that they're not actually a Christian.
It definitely helped in skinning the fat.
Yes, yeah. This kind of persecution trimmed a lot of the fat in the church, and so it was really only true believers who were still left and actually ended up being either executed, or in some places they would just have their right arm was cut off or their right hand. And so a very early issue that came up in church history was when Christianity became legal in 325 under Constantine. Then, or rather, it wasn't illegal anymore. Then there were a lot of people who weren't Christians before who started wanting to join the church and become Christians. But a lot of the Christians were either executed or had their right hand cut off. And so there's this major cost for people who actually professed Christ, and those who were investigated and would not affirm that they were believers, they were being released scot-free, but the people who did admit they were believers were facing major consequences. And so the church looks at this and they say, well, we have this massive influx of people who want to join the church, but do we let them in? Because they're only here because there's not persecution. They're only here because they're not getting their right hand cut off. They're not willing to profess Christ to the death. And Christ says, if you will not confess my name before men, I will not confess you before my Father which is in heaven. So these people clearly can't be saved, so why would we let them into the church? And it creates this huge rift very early in church history. And it's very interesting to get into, but that's part of why the Catholic tradition eventually developed to the point where the Pope has a lot of power to say who actually gets into heaven and who doesn't. But that's a later evolution of this very early question of, do we let people who denounced Christ join the church now that it's not a crime that you're being executed for?
Really hard because you're in one cell and you lose your hand, but the guy in the next cell, he doesn't commit, and then he wants to come to church with you later, and you're like, do I forgive you?
Yeah.
What do I do with you?
That'd be very difficult.
Yeah. It's a lot of grace.
And not only that, but you lost a lot of friends and family who were executed for their belief. And you're missing your hand, and this guy who was not willing to give up anything for Christ wants to come into the church and say who gets to be the pastor. That's really hard. Yeah. So anyway.
I have a question on that. What about the people that later were converted at that time, that hadn't found?
So that's where monasticism actually became very popular. Because in their culture, for the Christians of the time, one of the greatest honors was to die a martyr's death. To the point that some people were actually seeking out martyrdom. They would go and find a official like Pliny and say, hey, I'm a Christian, just so that they could be executed and receive the crown that's awaiting.
I think Andrew's happy.
He probably is.
Okay, you could probably hack his system.
Let's go back to. There we go. Hopefully he figures it out. Let me know if I need to switch it back at some point. Early Christians, monasticism. Becoming a monk was popular because dying a martyr's death was one of the most honorable things you could do at the time, to the point that people were seeking it out. And one of the earliest monks was actually a guy who was well known for fasting and sitting on top of a pole for like 3 weeks. And the earliest monks were pole sitters. And then they had people who started going out and fasting in the wilderness, like Jesus and John the Baptist and Moses. And people started viewing that kind of suffering for Christ the same way as they viewed dying a martyr's death or suffering persecution as a martyr. So for the early church fathers, most of the early church fathers in their writings actually highly valued monasticism because they viewed it as a kind of martyrdom. And it was a way to suffer for Christ even when you weren't under the persecution of the church. So for people who were later converts and who wanted the kind of status that someone who had their hand chopped off under persecution, they would go and become a monk and would live a life of deprivation so that they could show outwardly that they were suffering like those who had come before them. So that's kind of it's interesting how these things start with good intentions, but then they go the wrong way. Like someone purposefully becoming a martyr is a terrible idea and you shouldn't do that. But dying a martyr's death because you do praise Christ as King and God, and that's a wonderful thing. That is something that we should honor and praise. And there is a crown of glory waiting for the martyrs. But it's not necessarily something that should be pursued if it isn't coming to you naturally. So a lot of these traditions, you can see where they start. You can see where they're a good thing, but then you can see how it created a culture that continued the pursuit of things that are not necessarily the best. And so what I really appreciate about being a part of my faith tradition and the history that I'm from is the Baptist tradition has a very strong credence to just going back to Scripture and leaving aside some of these traditions that went sideways. And so the goal is to get back to a more primitive form of early Christian worship without everything else that the Catholics added, including things like requiring works for salvation or for sanctification. So being at this stage in church history with the tradition we have is actually a huge benefit because we get to lay aside a lot of the unhelpful traditions and we get to continue enjoying the embarrassment of riches we have for what the New Testament actually teaches and continue doing incredible scholarship in that field. So that's probably too much of an explanation, but does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
And no.
Okay.
Yes.
But for the people who were new converts, what are you still wondering for them?
Well, not only that, but if you see someone suffering, or you have a mentor or whatever, you're not like on the fence, but you're just wondering, and you see like James is mentoring me, right, and we're talking, but I'm on the fence, but not knowing which way to go.
Mm-hmm.
But then something happens to James, like I see James persecuted for something, then I realize, well, gosh, what he's doing is great. So there's got to be something in what he gave up his life for, or what he gave for. So then you do soul searching, you're like, oh, okay, that's what I'm getting at. So
yeah. So if someone does go through persecution, I would think so, because if you see someone who's willing to suffer for something they believe, then they must really be committed to it, and they're not, on the fence about it.
Right. So that's what I'm getting at, because you have great mentors that teach you things that you learn from. It's like, hey, and then they point out certain things to you, and then you're just like, oh, I never looked at it from that perspective before, that make you see the other side.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just curious on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's great application there. Yeah.
It would be hard to, so the people that were wanting to come back into the church that maybe didn't suffer the way that they did,
Mm-hmm.
trying to remember, well, Peter loved Jesus, and Jesus loved Peter to come back.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so trying to fight with that on your human side, you know, here, I lost my hand, or I lost my wife, or I lost whatever, and, but I'm supposed to forgive him the same way Jesus forgave Peter and give him that second chance. And,
Right.
you know, so yeah, it's struggle. With any of us, whenever we fall and get back up, it's hard to, because we, especially if you're one that they fell and you were hurt by their fall,
Mm-hmm.
back up and letting them come back.
Right. Yeah.
In other words, they should have just made a big giant letter of a sermon about Peter.
Maybe they did.
Yes. So Peter was a big part of the debate that was going on at the time because of the very fact that Jesus did forgive him and let him in. Yep.
He was doing this.
Well, I mean, when Ruby Mountain, when Tim Wetmore stopped being pastor and all that stuff in the area here, it was really hard for a lot of people to even think Ruby Mountain was a real church.
Mm-hmm.
And so those of us that were here were in some ways shunned. And then when we get the new pastor and whatever, we still were here.
Yeah.
But we weren't, and so looking at us and trying to get some
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
have Ruby Mountain stick around.
Right. So there's a very real connection that you have with history. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that having to forgive people is hard. Yeah. Yeah. And when it comes to any kind of abuse, though, people assume that there are signs. But most of the time, when it comes to abusers, they seem like the most helpful, trustworthy, and kind people. And when it comes out that they've actually been doing these horrible things, everyone's shocked. Who would have imagined? And that's one of the reasons why before I got here even Daniel was putting in effort to make sure that we had really good accountability for our children's programs. The policy that he put in place, having 2 people in the room with children and waiting outside the bathroom door while kids use the restroom, and all those things that he has as policies before I got here were there to protect both people from falling into sin, but especially the children who are at risk. And having accountability is helpful for everyone, even if they're helpful, trustworthy, and kind. Everyone needs the accountability, if nothing less than just in case someone gives a false accusation and you need to prove someone's innocence. So, yeah. But having those kinds of things, people assume if there has been a problem that those involved were complicit or somehow guilty alongside the perpetrator. But most of the time, people just don't know. They have no idea what's going on.
Still don't. Lots of rumors that are.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah.
But keep it.
Yes. We'll go on. So I'm about halfway through the letter. Bear with me. Let's see. Together with those of the gods, and who finally curse Christ, none of which acts, it is said, those who really are Christians can be forced into performing these. I thought it proper to discharge. Others who are named by that informer at first confessed themselves Christians and then denied it. True, they had been of that persuasion, but they had quitted, some 3, some others many years, and a few as much as 25 years ago. They all worshipped your statue and the images of the gods and cursed Christ. They affirmed, however, the whole of their guilt or their errors was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and they bound themselves by solemn oath. So now he's describing what these Christians were doing. A lot of the people who said, I used to be a Christian, but I don't do that anymore. It's been 25 years. I'm committed to the gods and to Rome and to the emperor, and I will curse Christ gladly. Those people described what kind of practices and rituals they went through. And so a lot of these practices, they were either current for the day or stretching as far back as 25 years in the past. Now, for someone who had been a Christian before, who hadn't attended a service in 25 years and who cursed Christ, they could still say what happened at a service, and they would be describing what happened at a service 25 years ago. So remember, this is in, 116 AD? You go back 25 years, this is while the New Testament is still being written. So we have testimony that's being put together here, but it includes testimony from people who were worshiping in the apostolic age while the New Testament was still being written. So we're talking, this is a very, very early record, a very early account of how Christians worshiped. And this is what they did. So they would sing a hymn, and they would sing in alternate verses. So one person would be the caller, and then the rest of the people would sing back to the caller, or they'd split in two sides, and one side would sing, and then the other side would respond. And they had this back and forth pattern that they would sing in. So they'd sing these alternating verses as a hymn to Christ, as to a God. You have lots of secular atheists who come along and say, you know what, Jesus Christ being a God was actually added by John much later on. Or this was added by Paul, or this was added by somebody. And if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he never claims to be God. He claims to be the Son of God, but lots of people were the Son of God. And they go into this explanation from their skeptical atheist viewpoint. But the reality is, history bears the record that the earliest Christian gatherings that we see are worshiping Christ as a God. Many of these people doing so even before, remember, 25 years, before John finished writing the book of Revelation. And for that to all come together and to happen so quickly and have so much popularity while the apostles are still alive, proclaiming and worshiping Christ as something that he was not, by something made up by the apostles, this explanation is just becoming so ridiculous. Who can really believe that while the apostles were still alive, people could come along and say, well, they didn't actually believe that Christ was a God? But the apostolic witness is there. They did believe Christ was a God. The people they trained said that Christ was a God. And the people who were worshiping at the same time that they were writing their letters claimed that Christ was a God. So, according to history, everything points to people believing that Christ was a God. What would give them such confidence that they were willing to go to the death for this belief, if not a true story based on fact? So basically, the atheists are wrong. They would choose a day at a fixed time before it was light. So they're picking some time before daylight to gather together. And they would sing alternating verses as hymns to Christ, as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, or deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and to reassemble to partake food. So remember, Christians are being derided because they're the weak people in the society. They're weak in their culture, so it's very easy to assume, and based on the other records we have, we know many of the early Christians were actually slaves. 50% of the Roman populace were people who were slaves. And so they had responsibilities, whether it be Sunday or Saturday, where they gathered. According to the New Testament, they were gathering on Sunday. So Sunday morning, they get up before daylight so that they could have a worship service before their duties for the day took them over. So then they'd gather together, they'd have this worship service, and they would give these oaths to do good things. And Pliny's admitting that. He's like, they're promising not to commit adultery, and if they're called before court to tell the truth, and they're swearing to not defraud their brother and to be honest in their business dealings. And he goes through this list of wonderful things that they're promising to do. And so you can kind of hear the tone in the letter. He's a little concerned that he's just executing all these Christians, and they're not really doing anything wrong, except they only worship Christ as God, and that's their only crime. So he's writing to Trajan to see, hey, what should I actually be doing with these people? Because right now I'm killing them. So I don't know if that was actually the tenor of what he was intending, but to me it sounds this way. He's a little concerned that he might be a little too harsh on these Christians because they're not doing anything bad. But then, after they did their day's work, they could come together in the evening and have a fellowship meal together. And so they're gathering together to reassemble to take food. But the food they're eating is of an ordinary and an innocent kind. Even this practice, however, they had abandoned after the publication of my edict, which, according to your orders, I had forbidden political associations. So we can read between the lines. Apparently, Trajan put out a decree that they were not supposed to allow anyone to have gatherings for political associations, and so no political gatherings. You're not going to have a Republican Central Committee in Rome. And so Pliny obeyed and put a ban on it, and the Christians actually obeyed the government. They quit having these fellowship gatherings where they would gather together and eat a meal together in the evening, but they were still worshiping Christ as God, and that was their great crime. I judged it so much the more necessary to extract the real truth with the assistance of torture from 2 female slaves, who were styled servants of the church. But I could discover nothing more than depraved and excessive superstition. So he's like, I investigated all these people, and this is what I came up with, but I decided to make sure that people are telling the truth, so I tortured 2 of them. And when torturing these women, the only thing that they would give me was superstition, and it wasn't helpful at all. I therefore adjourned the proceedings and betook myself at once to your council, for the matter seemed to me worth referring to you, especially considering the numbers endangered of all the ranks and ages and of both sexes, and will be involved in prosecution. For this contagious superstition is not confined to the cities only, but has spread through the villages and rural districts. It seems possible, however, to check and cure it. 'Tis certain, at least, that the temples, which had been deserted, now begin to be frequented, and the sacred festivals, after a long intermission, are again revived. He's like, the Christianity has taken over my entire district, and almost nobody's coming to worship the gods anymore. But after I started putting the pressure on them and enacting this persecution, started executing Christians, more people are starting to attend the idol worship. So I think we can save our society from the Christians if we really want to. But I want to leave it up to you, O great Trajan. So he goes on, let's see. While there is a general demand for sacrificial animals, which for some time past have met with but few purchasers, from hence it is easy to imagine that the multitudes may be reclaimed from this error if a door be left open for repentance. So that's the whole letter. It's fascinating because it shows the very early impact of Christianity on these different Roman territories, and it shows a lot of what they were actually doing and what they believed.
almost sounds like part of his other letter where he's describing all the people that are believing. Kind of makes me think he's like, we need to get Christianity out of here because the more Christians, true Christians we get, the more I have to execute, which means the less useful soldiers we get, and Rome's kind of population might diminish.
Yeah, yeah, you can see how there could be some second and third level fallout from everyone he's executing, right? So he's certainly concerned that with the more people converting to Christianity, the more people he has to execute. And then reading into that, you can certainly see more to it.
Could it also be too with the same thing that happened to Egypt, that like to what James was saying, there's more of them than there are of us, so there could be an overthrow.
There's certainly that concern, especially with people who are not willing to worship the emperor, because worshiping the emperor was one of the most sure ways to know that someone had allegiance to Rome. And so, yeah, the requiring allegiance to the emperor would imply that maybe they're loyal to someone else and are actually going to be terrible citizens. They're going to betray the empire and go join Carthage or something. So yeah, that's definitely a concern that they might have. What we see here from this evidence is just a very clear case that almost all historians look back on and acknowledge the clear devotion that Christ's followers had to him. Clearly, the core claims of the gospel were both known and recognized in the broader Christian world. So this is something that Roman officials know about. It's something that they're writing back and forth to each other about. And they know these people believe Christ is God. They believe that he has power. They believe that they have to be loyal to him, and they're willing to die for their belief. And it has taken hold of the empire very early on, under persecution, before any kind of forgery or involvement from Constantine or special ability to gain political power or influence through the church. Because you can definitely see, once Christianity becomes legal, people start trying to use positions in the church to gain power politically. But this is at a time where that was not at all a risk. And so all the accusations that maybe we don't know how the early Christians worshipped are not fair accusations at all. And that accusation actually comes from people like Jehovah's Witnesses, like Mormons. They're claiming, hey, we're going back to apostolic Christianity. What the early Christians believed is what we believe, and we're going back to what they taught. But when you go and look at the historical sources, a Jehovah's Witness won't say that Christ is God. And we know for a fact from history that these early Christians were worshiping Christ as a God. The Jehovah's Witnesses say you can only use our edition of the Bible because your edition has been corrupted by the Catholic Church. But those things that they say were corrupted by the Catholics, you go back and look at what the early Christians were practicing before the Catholic Church existed, and what you see in primitive Christianity is people affirming doctrines like the deity of Christ. It was something they were willing to die for. Now, as we're going into these apologetic conversations with a Jehovah's Witness, with a Mormon, with an atheist, when you go back to sources like this, they dismantle the arguments that Jesus, or the way we believe truth about Jesus, those things were later inventions or somehow mythology. By AD 112, Pliny is proving that Jesus' life was historically documented and known by non-Christian authorities, and that massive numbers of people had been converting to Christianity very early on in Christian history. So what does this show? Well, it shows that these are non-Christians who are providing external corroboration from someone who is opposed to Christianity. So this is corroboration coming from the enemies of the Christians, and showing that what we say the early Christians believed and how they practiced is actually what they said and did. These Roman sources provide non-Christian confirmation of Jesus' life, that he had lived. So we're thinking back to Josephus and and Suetonius. Josephus wasn't one of the Roman historians. We had Tacitus and Suetonius. And then now we have Pliny the Younger showing the practice of the early Christians. I think working through this letter, even though it's taken all of our time, is really worth it because it is incredibly interesting for us to see today, and it shows us the historical tradition in which we fall. We're a part of a long line of people going all the way back to the first century who worshiped Christ as God, who would gather together and have someone declare doctrine like Jeff does from the pulpit. They would sing together. They would pray to Christ as to a God. One practice that they would do that is something that we don't necessarily always do in churches today is they would have these creeds and oaths that they would take. And they would promise that they would not commit adultery while they're gathered in these Christian gatherings. Because biblical morality has so much become a part of our cultural fabric, it is seen as less of a need to make these oaths, because at the time, for the people living in Rome, they didn't believe that it was necessarily wrong for a husband to commit adultery against his wife. Men need sex, and so wherever they have the right to take sex, they could take sex. That's what the early Romans believed. And so if a Roman man owned a female slave, she was his property and he could have sex with her. But the Christians come in and they say, you're only supposed to be doing that within marriage. And so if you're going to gather and worship the Christ of the Bible, well, you need to take this oath that you're not going to commit adultery against your wife. And this is what adultery is, and so you need to take this oath. And it was reforming, those kinds of oaths were reforming the fabric of what was culturally acceptable for the people of the time. Now it's a part of our cultural fabric. We benefit from their faithfulness for literally thousands of years. And we take those things for granted. But they were a very early part of Christian worship services. But then, this is something that our church, as a Bible church, but being planted by Baptists, we certainly appreciate. They would gather frequently for meals together. And they would have a fellowship meal. And so, in line with the American Baptist associations that planted this church, it's a very common Baptist tradition to gather for fellowship meals. And so we do that, even though we're a Bible church now, we do that and we gather once a month and eat a meal together and enjoy fellowship with the other believers, and we say that that is a part of our worship. Well, it's as much a part of our worship now as it was in the first century, where they were gathering for fellowship meals as a form of worshiping Christ and spending time with his body, with the bride of Christ. So anyway, lots of history, lots of ways to prove the factuality of what we believe and why we believe it. Very interesting stuff. James, did you have a question?
No, I was just thinking about food.
Okay. Your fingers were starting to do the little...
Sorry.
I'm glad it was good food thoughts. That's a good thing.
Yes.
So, anyway, very interesting stuff. What you believe and what you practice is not anything new. It does have a lot of historical precedent, and it is based and founded in Scripture. So if someone wants to say that what you believe is false, well, they're going to have to go up against the majority of Western civilization for the majority of history, and go up against the majority of good scholarship, and go up against the majority of evidence, and go up against some of the most clear and obvious things when you go back and investigate things. The issues that we run into, where we have people who are deconstructing their faith, they feel like they can be some kind of a intellectual that is going to arise to heights never before seen and tear apart Christianity and take it down to the roots and deconstruct it. You'll notice that most of these people who deconstruct their faith are not going to these early Christian sources. They're not going to the early Roman sources. They're not going to the early Jewish sources. They're saying, well, what I believe is clearly a cultural construct, and there's no reason for me to actually believe it. And so I'm going to throw away everything that has any kind of connection with Christianity, and I'm just going to believe science. Well, they've already fallen into a Christian tradition because science as we know it today comes from Christian presuppositions and Christian beliefs. We believe that God created an incredible world. We believe that it was good the way he made it, that God does everything decently and in order. And so, nature can be studied. We can trust our senses. We can believe the measurements that we take, and we can use our reason to determine if our measurements were good or bad. And we can work through these things based on our Christian presuppositions. God did these things, so we can do these things. God's a creator, and he made us in his image, so we have the creative faculty to invent things and to innovate. And so it's no coincidence that in a Christian capitalist society, we have people doing things like inventing smartphones and building incredible satellites and building fantastic cars. And where does this stuff come from? It comes primarily from Christian belief, from Christian presuppositions and commitments. So anyway, the history is important because that is what underlies so many of the wonderful blessings we enjoy in a Christian society today. With that, I'll shut up. We can be done. Alex, will you close us in prayer?
Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time.